Hey Internet, it's me. I haven't done a gear video in a while, so I thought I would give you all some new content, and this was sort of spurred by a question that was posted on the Facebook page Fans of the Marshall Class 5. Now, it's a very, very popular little amp, sort of has a niche group, but one of the big questions that people often have, especially with the first generation of them that didn't have the anti-rattle and that had the tubes mounted up inside the chassis a little bit, is how do you retube this amplifier? And since I have a first generation, I thought that I would do a nice little video about the best way, I think, to take apart and retube a Marshall Class 5. So, follow along. You're going to be riding on my chest on a GoPro, and we will disassemble my amp and put it back together.
Okay, so here we have a first-gen Marshall Class 5, and as you can see, this is one of the nice, beautiful ivory ones. Mine is a 2010, and before we get started, let's go over some of the things that you're going to need. Obviously, you're going to need an amp. You are also going to need your new tubes. Now, I just recently retubed this amp, so I am basically going to be pulling the old tubes that are in it out and putting them back in for your benefit. The other thing I highly recommend is a screw gun. This can be done manually, but obviously it's going to be a lot easier if you have some sort of power screwdriver. So the first thing we want to do is we want to turn the amp over and lay it down on its face so that we're looking at it like this. This panel has to come off. This has to be unscrewed. And then we have two machine screws up here holding the chassis into the top of the amp that we need to get out. So the first one I like to attack is this one right here. And this is one that's kind of easy to forget. So I typically will pull him out first. Alright, and then we have this one here. And finally, this one here. So I recommend that you keep all of these together. After you remove the back panel, it simply comes out like this. And you can just drop the screws through three little slots there and keep them kept. Okay, so after we have this little center grate here removed, the next thing I like to do is go after these two machine screws that are holding the chassis in. So we will take our screw gun and remove each of these. And once again, we're going to take these out and set them aside. And sometimes the trim rings will come off with them. If they do, I just recommend keeping them captive on the machine screws so that they don't run away from you. So after we have the two, what I'll call top chassis screws out, then we have these four here. And then this entire panel will slide out. And before I go on, I actually do recommend doing this on the carpet because it helps you avoid marring the front of the amp. If you don't have carpet, then get a cheap rug that you can set down and just do this on the floor, because then you can lay the amp down and it just makes the whole process a little bit easier. Okay, I recommend keeping these screws captive in the back panel here. After you get it this far, what I do is I reach under here and support it with my left hand, and with my right hand push it backwards and back and up like this. And you want to be careful not to tug on the speaker wire too much, because these are just spade connectors and you can pop them off. So I will usually just flip it up and then set it on the base of the chassis right like that. Okay, so looking at our tubes here, obviously we have our two preamp tubes, and these are pretty self-explanatory. You simply do the nice, wiggle them back and forth in a circle, and they pop out, and installation is the reverse of removal. The one that's going to give you problems is the power tube right here, because it's mounted in this little retainer ring, and that retainer ring has a machine screw there that holds it to the chassis. So what I recommend doing is taking this whole assembly off as one unit, and then that just makes it a little bit easier. So what we're going to do is we're going to very carefully remove this machine screw, and it likes to run away. So just be aware of that when you take it out, and it has this little lock washer at the bottom, so you want to make sure that that stays captive. And then I typically set that aside in very plain sight where I can see it. Now that we have this loose, we're going to simply remove our power tube, and this retainer ring will come with it. And what you want to do is you want to see the notch there, and notice how that sort of lines up with this corner. That's going to be important because we're going to be reinserting this power tube into the retainer before we reinstall it. So this rubber ring can occasionally partially melt to the glass envelope of the tube, so you want to be kind of careful when you go to remove this power tube, because if you force them too hard, they are glass and they don't like to be forced. I typically push it up like that, and then you have your power tube out. Once again, installation is the reverse of removal. So we take it, line our notch up here, and then wiggle the power tube back into the retainer ring. Now it doesn't have to be exact, because we can turn this and move it a little bit, but I try and line up the glass envelope with the base of the retainer since they both sit flush with the chassis. So after we get this installed like this with our new power tube, this one is a new power tube, we are going to install the tube like that and just push it back into its socket. Now we have to line up the retainer ring, and we do that by just holding the power tube, and then we can turn this retainer ring a little bit, right like that, till we get it lined up. Now we're going to take our retaining screw for that and just set it in there. Then take our screw gun and just very gently then when you get it taut, I recommend using a fairly low torque setting. Like so. Now we're ready to reinstall the chassis. Okay, now those two machine screws that we set aside with their retainer rings, we want to get those because we're going to be using them. And so the first thing you want to do is flip the chassis back over into the amp, once again being careful not to tug too hard on the speaker cable. And you'll sort of want to flip it down here over towards the speaker. Sometimes you'll have a little clearance issue with the tube, but when you get it up like this, you just want to be able to clear the power switch at the top and then the tubes at the base of the speaker. So you'll notice if you let the chassis go here, it sort of wants to sag down towards the bottom of the amp. So what I do is I put one hand underneath the chassis and sort of push it up like this and hold it, and then what we're going to do is we're going to take our machine screws here and we are going to insert them into their female counterparts on the amp's chassis. And right now we're sighting them up. They only really need to be finger tight. One of the nice things is as these age, these get a little dust ring around the control panel trim, and you can sort of use that to sight where the chassis needs to be oriented to be able to install these. So once we have them threaded in, we're just going to take our screw gun, okay, so after we make sure that that is secure, now we're going to reinstall these 4 screws up here. Okay, now after you take this out and reinstall it a couple times, one of the things you're going to notice is that it reams the screw holes out a little bit and this probably won't sit exactly flush. If it bothers you, you can try reinstalling it again. I've never really worried about it. Nobody really looks at the back of the amp much anyway, so it remains functional ideal. Okay, the final thing is just reinstalling this metal grate. Slide it in there, it sits in like that. Now it's reassembled, and she is ready to rock and roll. That's how you retube Class 5.
So I hope that if you have one of these fantastic little amplifiers, that this video is helpful for you. Now I'm going to make the standard disclaimer that there are certain components inside tube amps that can hold a lethal charge for days after being turned off and unplugged from a power supply. So don't try going inside the amplifier. Don't stick your hands inside the chassis. If you just try and do the tube change and you don't try and do anything like touch the inside where the pins go, then you shouldn't run into where you're going to be touching part of the power supply. It's going to be live. Just be careful, and if you aren't sure what you're doing, or you tend to abuse things like alcohol and illegal drugs, take it to a professional and ask them to show you what's going on. Most techs are actually pretty cool guys, and I was actually taught to do a lot of the work that I do on my own amps by a technician. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to leave them in the comment box below, and if not, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you like my cat Christmas sweater. It is December 16th, and I'm on my way to a Christmas party after this. I will see you later, and happy rocking until then.